You're joining All Things College and Career for in-depth stories and advice with your hosts, Meg Gary and Bobby Ryan, owners of Academic and Career Advising Services.
Welcome back, everyone. Today we have Dr. Shemmassian. He is the founder of Shemmassian Academic Consulting and one of the world's foremost experts on medical school admissions.
Yes, Dr. Shemmassian's admissions expertise has been featured in various media outlets, including the Washington Post and Business Insider. He's also been invited to speak at Yale, Stanford, UC Berkeley, and other prestigious institutions about various aspects of the admissions process.
Yeah, we ask him a ton of questions about how to get into medical school, all the tricks and tips, and he just nailed every question without hesitation. He knows his stuff, so definitely tune in.
Yeah, anybody that's interested in applying to medical school, you will definitely want to listen to what Shirag has to say.
Absolutely. Okay, enough of our intro. Let's get on to our conversation with Dr. Shirag Shemmassian.
Let's do it. Hello, Shirag Shemmassian. Welcome to All Things College and Career. Thanks so much for joining us on our podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, Shirag, it's great to have you here. So where are we talking to you from today?
I am based in San Diego. Someone was asking me earlier today, how's the weather? I hope it's well. I'm like, well, it's kind of gray right now, but I never complain about it. It's always nice. So it's a treat.
Well, we spent some time living in the San Diego area too. And our neighbor, I always quote him because he says, the weather isn't perfect, but it's never bad.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, I'd agree.
It's never bad. So, okay. Well, we're so glad to have you here today. And we really want to focus today's podcast on getting into medical school. It's not easy. It's a stressful situation for so many people that really would love to get into medical school, but just think, am I cut out for it? What do I have to offer? Is anybody going to accept me? And all the stresses that go around with it. So we just want to get right into what it takes to get into medical school and how you can help students get there. Like, what are some of the things that they should be thinking about right off the bat?
Yeah. So it's a huge, huge question. And so I'll talk about it from the...
We'll break it down, right?
Yeah, from the 30,000 foot level.
Right.
And I'm sure we'll get into parts. So there are many paths to medical school. Most people, when they're looking to get into medical school, they're going to a traditional 4-year college or university. They're taking a bunch of prerequisite courses like biology, chemistry, physics, and math. You can participate in any major. There's no advantage to one major or another. And you have to pursue various extracurriculars. So like physician shadowing, getting patient exposure experiences, community service, research, all these different things. And then eventually you take an exam called the MCAT, which is, you could think of it like the ACT or the SAT, but for medical school. It's a monster of an exam. It's about 8 hours long, a really long test. And then you write a bunch of essays and get recommendation letters and interview and all that good stuff. So that's sort of the traditional path. And then some students who are listening to this more early on, or parents who are listening to this with younger kids, there's a direct medical path, which means you can get into medical school, sort of. I'll comment on that in a second, while still in high school. So there are various BSMD or BAMD or BSDO programs, whether you're pursuing an MD or DO degree, which we can talk about as well. And so essentially you would get early assurance into a medical school and you'll get into an associated undergraduate program. Now, it's not quite assurance at most programs these days because there are minimum MCAT requirements. So there used to be the case that there were more schools where the MCAT requirement was essentially waived. And then they started adding requirements with minimums, sometimes with increasing minimums. And so they're not as sort of assured for the most part as they used to be, but they're still a very attractive option for students who just want to know, okay, look, I have something in the bag, assuming I do reasonably well in school, I maintain a reasonable GPA and an MCAT score, and then I don't have to worry about applying in a few years' time, because acceptance rates in the States are notoriously difficult. In each application cycle for MD programs across the country, the matriculation rate across the board is about 40%. meaning about 60% of people don't matriculate anywhere.
Right.
And that's interesting. That application process is, I think people underestimate how rigorous it is and how expensive it can be. Because a lot of these students or applicants are applying to a number of schools and they're flying around and having to go on interviews. So if you can skirt that process, you're in great shape. But it's also true, I believe, that you have many programs that offer this also require a minimum GPA in many cases, or, like you have to maintain a pretty high, almost perfect GPA.
Wow. Yeah. And that's tough. And the other thing is, it's like, so you do all that work, you get into that program, or even if you didn't sign up for the combined bachelor's with MD program, regardless, even if you're striving for medical school and say you have a decent GPA, but not great, and say you, and correct me if I'm wrong, I just heard this, but I'm not sure because I've never gone to medical school, but there's only so many times you can take the MCAT per year, or is it, I don't know. I think there's a limit, but I guess my point is, what do the students do that don't have a great MCAT score and don't have a great GPA? Is it hopeless for them? Are they like, well, med school is not going to happen for me? Or is there an avenue that they can get in?
Yeah. When you say not so great GPA, not so great MCAT,
I know.
it's one of those things where
I quantify.
Yeah, because it's such a rabbit hole. Each of these questions takes us down a rabbit hole, and there are levels of great and not so great. So just to put some numbers around this whole thing for listeners. Typically, when we're talking about a good GPA for medical school admissions, we're talking a 3.8 plus. A 3.8 plus GPA in college. And in medical school, it gets even more, I guess, nuanced than that, because there's the science GPA. So this GPA you had in your science courses. Then they have a quote unquote all other GPA, which is non-science, most people say. And then there's the combined. So then people ask questions, well, which one matters most and stuff like that. You want all of them to be high. But I guess if you're, asking me to wager on something, science GPA is probably the most critical one. And so assuming you have a 3.8 plus, you're okay on the GPA side. If you have a 3.7, you're still in okay shape. When you start getting into the 3.6, 3.5, you still can get in. It's just becoming more and more of an uphill climb. So a 3.7 GPA, it shifts every year, 3.74, whatever the case might be, is the average matriculant GPA for MD programs. So you want to be pretty high. And then on the MCAT side, you want to get a 511 plus MCAT score. And that probably doesn't mean a ton to a lot of people listening to this, but it's in the 80th plus percentile, essentially.
Right. That's helpful.
And then the higher, the better. And so the average score is 500. It ranges from a 472 to a 528. Why? We'll talk to the MCAT developers maybe one day. But the median score is a 500. It's not a good score of 500. So you want to be ideally on the low end, like at a 512 plus. Okay, 80th, 85th percentile plus on that side. And so that's where we're talking about MD programs. And we're assuming that extracurriculars are good, essays are good, you're not bombing anything major or whatnot. Now, what happens if you have below? Well, now we get into the how much below question. So let's say there's a student who, I don't know, I'm going to make up numbers here for conversation.
Yeah.
So you have a 3.6 GPA and you have a 506 MCAT score. Is everything lost? No, it's not. The short answer is no, because it gets complicated, because there are some state schools for MD programs that are much easier to get into than state schools in other states. So for instance, if you live in New Mexico, like University of New Mexico, statistical expectations are nowhere near as stringent as, say, you're in California and you're looking to apply to a UC school, like you're applying to UC San Diego or Irvine or LA or whatever the case might be. And then also things like demographic backgrounds and things like that really play a role, because the average the average stats of students from certain background are much higher than students from different backgrounds. Sure. And then if you have an amazing extracurricular profile, maybe your numbers are a little lower, but you have, 3 first authored publications, a patent, and all these amazing things, you might be able to overcome it. There are some really special students out there. Okay. So say your stats are lower, but you're not in a state that strongly prefers in-state residence with lower statistical expectations. You're not the next Einstein. You're not all this stuff. It's still
Right.
over. Still, the answer is no. So it's going to be harder to crack an MD program, but this is where we have to talk about DO schools as well. So DO is Doctor of Osteopathic Medicine relative to MD, which is what we typically think of as physicians, which are doctors of allopathic medicine. Now, the difference between the two training modalities used to be far greater than what it is today. So historically, sort of the DO world was looked a little down upon because not all of their work was evidence-based practice. And so they were using a lot of stuff that, maybe didn't have a lot of research behind it. Folks were critical of that. Now, they always practiced holistic care, right? So considering a bunch of different factors in a person's life and making sure to modify treatment towards that. Over time, MD physicians have started practicing more, I guess, holistically, whole person considerations. And DO physicians have been practicing increasing levels of evidence-based care. From a training standpoint, they've converged more so than at any other point in history. Now, is there still a stigma against DO physicians where in the medical
hierarchy?
Yes, there is. Now, a lot of people might not admit that, but like if you're applying to, residencies as a DO physician, or you're looking to get into more competitive specialties, it's probably gonna be harder for you to crack as a DO physician. But for most people, if you're looking to get a residency in not neurosurgery or ophthalmology or dermatology, and you're not looking to be in Boston, New York, LA, Bay Area necessarily, will you still get a residency? Can you still have an amazingly fulfilling career? Yes. Will everyone still call you doctor? Can you still practice as an MD does? Yes. But I think personally, people struggle with that. Yeah. I hear things all the time like, I just always saw myself as an MD physician. So it's like that letting go of what you thought you had to be and being okay with, hey, I'm still going to be a physician. That's the most important thing. The degree, okay, I'll live with that, or what have you. So you can be a DO physician. I'll pause there because there are still more, not necessarily.
Oh, right. Physicians assistants but yeah.
Oh, not even like Caribbean schools and international. So there's a lot more to go down. But to give, again, a high level, it just depends on what percentage of MDs versus DOs, or maybe Caribbean schools that have American accreditations. There's a whole slew of things you can do to still become a physician.
And in our area, we've learned to embrace the DOs because we have so many of them. We have a DO school in our region, so we've had a lot of DO physicians.
It's a very good one.
Yes, U.N.E, yes.
Yep, on the best.
Yeah, I do think it might be worthwhile for our listeners to hear some other options. You mentioned the Caribbean schools, and what other else beyond that would you say?
Yeah, sure. So for folks who, have really low grades and they're sort of like, they're like, all right, I'm going to make a last ditch effort. And essentially, like, if I'm going to be a doctor, this is the way I have to do it. Students will apply to Caribbean medical schools, which historically and even today don't have the best reputation. For various reasons. They have higher attrition rates, large classes, and all. And I think people, sometimes go there, they feel a little bit isolated. They feel like they might not have the support systems that they need to succeed and things of this nature. But there are some that have been around for some time. They have proper accreditations like St. George's or American or SABA and all these things. And students from these schools can do away rotations in their third and fourth years of medical school. So they'll come stateside and they'll do rotations and they can match into U.S. residencies. Now, again, will their ceiling for residency match probably be lower than their U.S. MD counterparts? Yes. But again, if you're looking to be a physician, it's another option to consider. And then you get the question of, okay, if I can go to Caribbean schools and get an MD versus stay in the U.S. and get a DO, do I take the Caribbean because it's an MD? Because then it starts getting really complicated because people, I think, group all these schools together. So if you're talking about U.N.E in Maine, right, it's one of the best osteopathic medical schools that has, so the name of the school matters too. I think sometimes we say, no one would say when you're thinking about MD programs, no one would say, oh, Harvard Medical School and UMass are the same. They're both MDs. You wouldn't say that. Everybody knows that Harvard is, at the top or near the top. Now, when we talk about DOs, people tend to cluster them like they're all the same things. No, but there's still stratification within that. Same thing with Caribbean schools. And then more recently, there are new programs between hospital systems in the United States and international medical schools. So a prime example of that is the University of Queensland in Australia has a partnership with the Ochsner Medical System in New Orleans.
Wow.
And so you would go to medical school in Australia for like 2 years, come to New Orleans and stateside and do rotations. It's still a newer program, so it doesn't have the same reputation. But if you're looking to get an MD and, go to an accredited program and practice in the States and stuff. So there are all of these options as well. And then there's international schools, like people talk about going to Ireland or somewhere in Europe and all that kind of stuff. Those get trickier and trickier because now you have to sort of come stateside, do various rotations, which are harder to get, and residency becomes tougher. Still doable. It's just every time you sort of go down this list, hill climb becomes more steep.
So you would recommend the Caribbean schools over the European schools for that reason, that there's an additional layer? Not that they're less than, but there's an additional layer to seamlessly transition into working in the US, basically.
Yeah. So typically, if you're graduating from Europe, you're going to have to get various rotations. So a lot of students who finish in the Caribbean, if you've done well in school and you've done well on your board exams, like the STEP exams and things like this, which are actually step one's going pass fail starting next year, which was a whole thing when the news came out a year or so ago.
Wow.
So that's why people worry, well, does school name matter even more now because the standardized tests they're removing? Chances are yes, but then also MD and DO residencies are converging rather than being available to just one group or the other. So it's getting complicated. We're in the middle of a very interesting transition period where school name will probably become more important in some ways. And so it'll remain to be seen how like European school, like graduate Southern, but oftentimes people who graduate from there, they'll come to the States for a year or two, do research, do clinical work, maybe clinical research before going to residency. So the path does get a little bit tougher, I think, for most European graduates. And then, of course, some students in the States say, well, what about Canada? Can I just go to Canada? Canadian schools on average are actually probably harder to get into for two reasons. One, they prefer Canadians. And B, Canadian med school expectations are insanely high. In Canada, you have to get 95 plus percentile MCAT scores and way high GPAs to be seriously competitive. So if you're doing that as an American citizen, the odds are really, really stacked against you.
So why would an American want to do that? Would the cost be a lot less if they were able to get into a Canadian school?
Oh, it's just people exploring options, frankly. They'll say if I can't get in the US, what about Canada? They'll assume it's easier because it's not a USMD, but it's only harder.
So, okay, well, let's get into the nitty gritty a little bit. So when it comes to extracurriculars, let's say, are there things that medical schools really look favorably upon, or is basically just to show that you have interests outside of academia?
Yeah. So there are 4 pillars to extracurricular experiences. So there's physician shadowing, which is essentially you follow around different doctors and you observe them doing daily work. And then there's patient exposure, which is actual care provision. Now, what that looks like can vary quite a bit. You have pretty intense experiences like EMT work or being a certified medical assistant. You can also do something like be on a crisis text line or a suicide hotline. So even though you're not in person, you're the direct care provider. Some people, or the phrase they use is, they say, you got to be so close to the patient, you can smell them, which I find kind of gross. But the idea is like, you have to be close enough where you're the one actually delivering care, not just observing from a distance, right?
My friend's son was a phlebotomist, and that was his patient exposure. And that's just a tip there for listeners. You may want to try that avenue.
Yep, exactly. And assisted living facilities and hospice care. These were a little bit easier to get pre-COVID because, obviously our elderly population and nursing homes were ravaged. And so people there have been extra sensitive to having non-essential healthcare workers. So the more essential you become, certifications, EMT, all that kind of stuff, the easier it is for you to secure great opportunities. So think ahead because some of these take 3-month-long courses. And so those are the first 2 pillars. The third pillar is community service. Community service can look like a lot of different things. It can be, starting after school tutoring programs for students from low-income backgrounds. It can be, starting an urban garden in the inner city and, serving people who live in a food desert part of town, educating them on nutrition, starting mobile clinics for healthcare services. There are all sorts of things you can do. And then there's research, which is research. But then people ask me sometimes, like, what's better, a dry lab or a wet lab? Do I need to work with beakers and pipettes? No. It's okay if it's a quote unquote dry lab, whether it's neuroimaging work or, clinical research, so long as it has medical applications, then it's fine. Yeah.
I'm curious, if somebody's interest in applying to medical school is non-clinical, they want to be a researcher, maybe cure cancer or something, and that's a reason for going.
Just cure cancer.
Just throwing it out there. But is it as important that they job shadow physicians or have that clinical experience if their real primary role or interest is research?
Yes. So it is absolutely necessary to get experiences in the 4 areas that I described, regardless of what your career goals are. Okay. So I'm actually glad you bring up, now we're getting pretty nitty gritty. I like this.
We're getting nitty gritty. Yeah.
We're getting in the weeds.
Yeah. So a lot of people who love research, the biggest red flags I see or Achilles heel that I see on their applications are that they talk so much about research that they forget the end beneficiary, if you will.
The human, right? At the end. Yeah.
At the end of the day, medical schools are primarily training clinical physicians. And even if all you want to do is be in a pathology lab for the rest of your career, you still have to demonstrate interest and experience in working with the end beneficiary. Okay. Right. And that's even true if you're looking to do an MD PhD, which requires, usually 2,000 plus research hours in undergrad and beyond before getting in, right? So if that's the case, yes. I mean, you have to demonstrate a commitment to the field and medicine and all that kind of stuff. Also, med schools know that things change. Sometimes people, in undergrad, all they do is I don't know, neurology work or neurosurgery related work. And then they write in applications, I want to be a neurosurgeon. Then they look closed off to the education, and the med schools don't really like that. So you have to demonstrate commitment to the field and all the facets of the field, even if look, I know I'm not going to be the 9-to-5 doc who sees patients, clocks out and goes home.
Yeah, that's a great answer. A lot of people think if I'm just going to do research or I'm never going to treat a patient, this is good information for them to have, for sure. Right. Yeah, I noticed on your website, you talk about the superstar. Like, what does it mean by being a superstar? Yeah.
So being a superstar means in 1 or 2 areas of, extracurriculars, you want to be a superstar. You want to have tons of hours, major impact and achievement, and so on. So most students will do a pretty generic thing. They'll develop what I call a well-rounded profile. Well-rounded, when it comes to med school admissions, is a derogatory term. In other words, you've done a lot of stuff, but there's no clear thread or theme here. So you get, let me give you an example of this. So let's say you shadowed, I don't know, a gastroenterologist and a neurologist. You did research in cardiology. You tutored kids, from low-income backgrounds. And I don't know, the patient exposure work you did was you did a crisis text line. Cool. So you've checked all the boxes. I don't really know what your deal is. I don't know what makes you stand out.
What drives you?
Yeah. And let's follow, Meg's question about the cancer research a little bit more, because there's a good example there about how to be a rock star. So just because you need to get experiences in all 4 categories doesn't mean you need to be equally good in all 4. In fact, I would discourage people from trying to be pretty good at everything. I'd rather have you be sufficient in everything and amazing at 1 or 2 things.
Yeah.
And so if I'm trying to be cancer research gal, great. All right. So now maybe I'm doing a lot of cancer research, whether it's basic science or clinical research. And perhaps, my service work is really related to educating the public about getting routine examinations about cancer, especially as people move into middle age and elderly age and all that kind of stuff. And perhaps I belong to an ethnic minority group or a group that doesn't historically utilize medical resources as well. and I create, information in their own language. I have doctors come out and speak to them. I set up mobile clinics to go to them, all that kind of stuff. Now I'm talking about not only cancer research, but cancer prevention and education and all this kind of stuff. And even if my direct patient contact isn't as strong and my shadowing is whatever minimal, that's okay, because I've developed this clinical and research focus on making sure that we prevent and cure cancer. Now, that doesn't mean in your essay you should say, all I want to do is cancer research and oncology and all this kind of stuff, but you've built basically on top of each other. So that's really impactful to build on something like that. But it's not only limited to research. People think if I'm going to develop into a superstar, it's through research, because the good schools are the research schools. That's what people think. Like the top 10, top 20 schools are quote unquote research schools. And that's not true. It's not like they don't have service and clinical expectations. They do. So I know students who their superstar status had to do more so with child welfare policy. So they worked a lot in the community to make sure that kids were getting great like social welfare services, that parents were getting great services to take care of their kids, whether it was through food assistance or, health access or whatever the case might be. They spent a lot of time in the summers doing policy work with their state's politicians. And a lot of their research was almost like sociology and healthcare access and things like that. They weren't in a wet lab or anything like that. And so service work and policy was their superstar thing. Right. I think because research is probably the most tangible, in the sense that I spent X number of hours in a lab, I had Y number of publications. People flock to that because they want to say, okay, if I get this, I'm okay, right? If I do this many hours or this many publications, I'm assured, right? Like we try to distill it into numbers. So when things are a little more gray, like how do you really quantify someone's policy rock star status? I think people get nervous and they sort of find shelter in things that they can quantify. But I just want to tell, so there's the example of the student who just wants to do research. There's also the example of the student that doesn't want to be a researcher, and they can also build a profile in other areas.
That's great information. You're providing amazing content here, and I love every minute of it. So when it comes to the interview for medical school, what kind of advice can you give our listeners about how to handle the interview, how to best prepare?
Yeah. So medical school interviews, this is fun. So there are two kinds of medical school interviews. There are subcategories as well, but at a high level, there are traditional interviews. Traditional interviews are, why do you want to be a doctor? Tell me about a time when you felt this way or that way. Why do you want to come to our school? Things like that. And then there are MMI interviews, otherwise known as multiple mini interviews. Okay. So an MMI interview is essentially you're placed into various situations and you have to deal with those situations. So you might be asked a question about medical ethics. They might put you in a room with an actor acting as a patient, and they just want to see how you talk to somebody like that. They might place you in a room with another applicant and you have to solve a task together. Maybe you're the person providing directions or you're the person being given directions. How do you do that? Maybe you're asked a traditional question. So essentially there are different pods you would go to and you would deal with various situations. And so it's more of a behavioral interview rather than the traditional, because there's a lot of research to suggest that traditional interviews are not very effective at predicting who's going to do well in the ways you want them to do well, versus an MMI, which is, well, let's actually see what they do and judge them accordingly.
Wow.
So there
sounds awful.
I was thinking the opposite, Meg. I would do much better in those kind of interviews.
Yeah, you would love it. Yeah.
When someone's just sitting there bombarding you with questions and you're supposed to come up with these great I'd rather be in a scenario where I have to perform. Then that's funny. That might be one of those assessments that we take in careers.
What does that say about you if you like traditional versus MMI?
Exactly. What does that make me?
Well, both varieties sound terrible to me, but there's that. I don't know.
Yeah.
I have a quick question. So I'm just curious if there's a recommended gap, I guess, for lack of a better term, between undergrad and going on. Do the medical schools admissions look favorably upon a certain amount of years in between, or or no years at all, or what's the preference there, or is there none?
Yeah. So some folks might be familiar with the phrase correlation does not equal causation. Right. And so a lot of scientists like to use this. So just because two things are related doesn't mean one causes the other. Okay. And why do I bring this up? Because the average age of matriculation these days into medical schools here in the States is 24 point something. So it's somewhere between 24 and 25 years old. Now, people take that number to mean what? Medical schools prefer older people. So, but correlation does not equal causation. It's not 24 because they prefer it. It's 24 because some people simply aren't ready to go straight through. And there are some people, a much smaller subset, of course, who are non-traditional. They might start medical school at 28, 30. They might have been a lawyer. They say, I don't want to be a lawyer anymore. I want to be a doctor. Or they were a baker before and they just want to be, whatever the case might be. So they're career changers as well. Now, people ask me, do I recommend gap years? Do I think they're good? Do I think they're bad? I don't recommend or not recommend them generally. I recommend them for people who need it or want it. If somebody wants to go straight through, as many of our students do, and they're ready, they don't need to take a gap year. And if they don't want to take a gap year, they have my full green light. So if you're able to achieve a strong GPA in undergrad, you have the requisite extracurriculars, you took the MCAT early, and you're ready to apply between junior and senior year of undergrad, great. You don't need a gap year. Now, if your stats are low and you need to do post-bac programs or master's programs to boost your GPA, or you need more time to take the MCAT, or you're lacking in research hours, or whatever the case might be, and you need that gap year or two, then by all means, you should take a gap year. But don't do it simply because you think you're too young and you need to do it. Also, and then the flip of that is sometimes I get, and talk to people that say, I'm 26, 28, 30. Is this going to be a hindrance? Do they not want old people like me? It's funny. Once you get into your mid-20s and late 20s, a lot of pre-med students think they're 70 years old. And I'm like, you're not 70 years old.
Yeah, he probably said, you are young.
Yeah, you're fine. But a lot of people are like, I don't want to go to school the rest of my life. I want to settle down. I want to have family. Their sort of heads go. And then they assume that med schools don't want them. Actually, medical schools really value non-traditional applicants and students. You have life experiences that others don't. You have a certain level of clarity about what you want to do that others might not. And so long as you frame it as an asset, like, hey, I've explored this stuff. This is what I want to do now. This is how I pursued it. Like, I'm not going, this isn't a flash in the pan, type of decision. It can actually be a major asset to you. So hope that answers the gap year question. Yeah. So sometimes yes, sometimes no, but it depends.
Yeah. Don't put too much attention on the average stats. Focus more on your readiness and what you bring to the table kind of thing. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, I love that.
So I'm curious about that personal statement that you have to write for medical school. And if you have any tips on what should go into a personal statement and maybe what the medical schools are looking for in a personal statement. And you'll want to hear this answer from Shirag after this quick message from Meg.
Thank you, Bobby. I just wanted to quickly break in here to share. I am now an FCD instructor, so if you would like to become a certified career counselor through the NCDA, I can now make that happen for you. I also offer career coaching and academic advising. To learn more about any of these services, please visit my website, Academic and Career Advising Services. I will include that link in the show notes. Now, back to the podcast.
Yeah. Number one topic I get questions about.
Oh, really?
Well, I don't know. It's actually neck and neck between like, here are my stats. What are my chances? That's the first question. And then the second question is, what do I write about my personal statement? So the personal statement is a huge subject area. So the personal statement for medical school, they provide you with a very generic prompt. So with the MD programs, they say, use the space provided to explain why you want to go to medical school. You got 5,300 characters with spaces and you got to spill it all. Right. And people get really nervous. First they get excited, like, oh, cool, I can write about anything. And then they're like, what do I write about?
Yeah.
Right? And so they get really nervous. And most students, they have an experience where they pull up their resume and they say, okay, I'm going to write about the most unique thing. So I'm a ballet dancer and, I feel like that's unique. I'm going to talk about that and how medicine is like an art. And there you start writing. Other people who say, no, I want to sound really pre-medi and, I'm really committed to medicine. And so they'll start off with, a story about like, I was on an ambulance and it was 5:47 and the streets were empty, but then there was this family and I could see the gash and, they have some, obscure medical term and, to try to quote unquote hook the reader. And then they'll read and they'll be like, it's kind of cliche. I feel like everyone else could have written about this. And So they do. One of the biggest mistakes with writing the medical school personal statement is mind reading, trying to figure out what the reader wants to hear and then modifying your story to meet this, I don't know, this
Fictional
expectation you think that they have, right?
Yeah, right.
As though all of these admissions committee members are clones of one another. They're just dispersed throughout the country and they all think the same and all this kind of stuff. So you get into trouble when you do mind reading and you say, oh, I read a bunch of essay examples online and everyone seems to have an aha moment. That's the moment, I saw that patient, she cried and I held her and that's the moment I knew I want to be a doctor.
Right.
And people say, but I don't have an aha moment. I'm like, you don't need to have an aha moment. Well, then why do all the essays have aha moments? Right? So they see what's out there and they try to fit their square story into a round hole, right? To mix metaphors. So that's where people make mistakes. My advice to students is let's work backwards. Okay, what impression do you want to leave on the AdCom or the admissions committee member? Okay. And so what qualities do you want to communicate? One of the exercises that I love to give students, and it's an uncomfortable one for a lot of people, ask your family and friends what they think of you and why they like you. When they think of you, what comes to mind? What others think of us is oftentimes very different than what we think of ourselves. Other people also find us more interesting than we find ourselves. I never wake up and think, I'm Shirag Shemmassian. This is awesome. I've never thought that in my life because I'm me. I wake up as myself every morning, right? And so none of us think we're the most fascinating
Not that
people.
Impressed.
Right. I'm just not that.
Just another day.
Hair. It's just, I'm just still me.
We see all our flaws very clearly.
Exactly. But because we don't think we're interesting, we think nothing we're going to write is going to be interesting to others. So it's really nice to find out from others what they think of us, right? And so sort of what are those qualities that stick out? And then, figuring out what qualities I want to communicate. And then think about your personal and professional experiences that best highlight those qualities and that you can use and string along to describe your path to medicine. It could be when you were young. It doesn't have to be when you were young, right? But stories that really capture your path to medicine and demonstrate the qualities you want to communicate. If that ends up meaning that you should talk about ballet in the intro paragraph, cool. If not, that's okay too. In other words, there's no inherently better or worse topic. People ask me, I'm going to write about this. Is this a good topic? Well, we all know movies that have a great premise but are terrible movies.
Right.
We also know movies that start out with that's a questionable premise and then it's an awesome movie. So the way you pull it off and how personal you make it is far more interesting and powerful than the topic chosen or some preconceived idea of, what you think that a reader wants to hear. So it's in fact I ask people all the time, what's the actual story of why you want to be a doctor? And then they tell me this really interesting story. And I'm like, why don't you write that? I don't know. I just don't think that because I don't know. I just don't, it's more mental about you thinking you're not interesting. You stand in your way more than anything else in this process. So get clear on the qualities you want to communicate, the foundation you want to set for the rest of your application, and only choose experiences that highlight that.
I love that. Right. So start with the end in mind and utilizing examples and stories to highlight that. That's perfect.
Exactly.
Yeah. We all like a good story. So what do you have for tips for applicants that just lack confidence? I know you've given a lot of good scenarios about, hey, you don't give up. You can still get in to medical school if you have some of these elements. But what do you say to someone that comes in and says, I just don't know if I can do it?
Yeah. So anxiety, you're going to experience anxiety.
Sure.
If you're anxious going into this process, it just means you're pre-med and you have a heartbeat. It's normal. And and you always believe that that you have a problem that others don't, that everyone else is better than you. So if you have I see students sometimes with a 3.9 and a 520 MCAT score, which is a insanely high
Insanely
MCAT
high.
score.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then they'll say, yeah, but like the median of this school that I want to get into is a 3.93. I have a 3.92 and it's a 521. So, and everyone else I only have 2 publications, not 4. So and then you have students who are way lower than that. They might have a 3.7 and a 5.13, and they might say, nice, dude, first world problems. Like I wish I wish I had your problem, So you're going to worry no matter where you are on the spectrum. I just want to highlight that just because you're worried doesn't mean you're not going to get in. You're worried because that's what you do with this process. It's hard. And I recognize that. So I guess, how do you get confidence in this process? 2 things. Number 1 is actually do an assessment of your profile. I don't have enough of this. Do you actually not have enough of this? Is it because you read something on a Reddit forum?
Right.
Or did you actually speak with a professional who knows whether this is good enough? And sure, you're low in one category. We all focus on the one. I have 12 publications. I have these numbers, but my clinical hours are lower. But the other stuff's so good. You can buffer against it, right? So do an actual analysis of what's going on. And then the other thing is, don't just focus on numbers. Again, we find so much comfort in numbers because we can actually say 90 percentile. That means 90% of people are at or below the score. I know where I stand. And so people like to worry about the stuff they can quantify. So even if you're below a school's median by a little bit, or you're right at it, does not mean it's all over. You can have great essays and extracurriculars. A median literally means the 50th percentile score, the middle score. So when people tell me the school has a 514 median, I have a 513, I don't meet their cutoff. A median is not a cutoff. And literally half of the people were below and half were above. So again, stop misinterpreting things. Because if you don't believe it, you're not going to try. You're not going to put forth your full efforts. So it's kind of conflicting pieces of advice. I feel like I'm giving. It's like, get clear on where you actually stand rather than worrying about just like your opinion on, or that just because if you think you're more anxious, it means you're worse off. Not necessarily. You might just be a more anxious person. That's one. Second, not to put all of the stock in the numbers.
I do have one final question. I know we need to wrap up here, but how many schools do you recommend applying to?
Another huge question. So it depends
I've heard many that apply well over 20.
Oh, yeah. 20
is that normal?
20 is sort of the minimum we recommend for our students. Like if you're really strong academically and you have a balanced list, you could get away with 20. But some of our students apply to upwards of 30, 35. And it depends on how competitive you are and how competitive your list is. So the stronger you are academically and the less competitive your school list is, the fewer you can apply to.
Yeah.
Conversely, the less competitive you are and the more competitive your school list is, the more you should apply to. And so if you have amazing, let's say you have that 395 and the 524 and the publication, all that kind of stuff, and you say, hey, I only want to apply to 20 schools within the top 25. Okay, you'll probably be fine, especially if you have great essays and extracurriculars and so on. Now, if you have a 3.7 and a 512, you should probably up that number. Now, if you're like, look, I don't want to apply to 35 schools, but I don't want to apply more than one. I just want to do this once, get it right. Well, then now you have to think about, okay, maybe you introduce 5 DO schools and do 20 MDs. So you have sufficient schools, I guess, on the lower end of the competition spectrum, just to balance things out a bit. It's like a sliding scale, if you will.
Totally get that.
Well, I kind of wanted to get into your experience a little bit because I know your parents immigrated here, and I'd like to know what your experience is, and it might help other people that have come to this country and are seeking to go to medical school or something along those lines.
Yeah, so I think a lot of immigrants and kids of immigrants will get what I'm saying here. So my parents, they came here from Lebanon in the late 70s, fled the civil war over there, and they were all about like security. You go to school, you get a great education, you get a good job with benefits and something that's highly respected that never goes out of style. Again, security.
Sure.
And what better
you can
thing?
Understand why.
I get it. I totally get it.
I get it. Yep.
And so for them, being a physician or a dentist or an engineer or a lawyer, like those kinds of things really resonated. Now, both of my parents are educators, and so they didn't go to, medical school or anything like that, but they wanted that for my brother and me. And so they always pushed that hard. If I said, oh, I want to be a doctor. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. What kind of doctor do you, it was always like that. And so students, I always encourage them to reflect on, do you want to do this? Yes or no? But also why? Like, what are you doing? Are you doing it for you? Are you doing it for your parents? What aspect of it interests you? And just really be thoughtful about that. Because at the end of the day, this isn't a, next 2 years decision. It's a next 30, 40 year decision. But that also means that if you really want to do it and your numbers aren't perfect and you're going to apply a little bit later, you are that 25-year-old who hasn't, gone to medical school yet. You're going to do this until you're 65, 70, that kind of thing. So it's not a short-term decision, and to take this stuff very seriously, because it is a long road. For most people, it is an expensive road. And just be very thoughtful about, are you doing it for you? Are you doing it for your parents? Because expectations, I hear a lot of I just always thought I would do this. Well, you're making the decision today about the future, not about what you always thought since 12. Right. And so get really serious about that decision, because, you can have a very fulfilling career and life and still be respected and impactful in your community, whether or not you do medicine.
Right. Absolutely. So what would you recommend? Is it more difficult to apply to an out-of-state public university or an elite private? Is your best chances of admission to apply to your own state school? If you could just touch on private versus public, state, in and out of state, that sort of thing. I think that's something a lot of people will wonder.
Yes. So different state schools have different
admission rates
admission rates for in-state and out-of-state.
For in-state. Okay? So check those, number one, maybe.
Absolutely. So there's an insanely helpful tool called MSAR, MSAR, which the folks who run the admissions process, the AAMC, they have a giant database where you can see, of in-state applicants and out-of-state applicants, how many got interviewed. And then you can check out the interview rates and see how selective they are for in-state and out-of-state. And then obviously there are statistical differences in terms of, just because something's a state school doesn't mean it's necessarily easier for you. So let's take Michigan. The University of Michigan is a very elite medical school. And so, if you're from Michigan, obviously that helps you with Michigan. It's going to be much harder to get into UMich than it is another state public school, right? And so the specific schools matter and all that kind of stuff. So let's say that you have a 3.7 and a 5.13 in Michigan. Should you apply to University of Michigan? Yeah, you probably should. Now, does that mean that there might be a school out of state, like a private one, that's going to be easier for you to get into? Yeah, if it has lower average statistical expectations, it might. But now if I'm in California, I'm a California citizen and I'm applying to University of Michigan, which has an in-state preference, there might be another elite private school that's actually easier for me to get into than the University of Michigan. Not easy, but easier, right? And so you it gets very granular. But then certain states you're from North Carolina and you're applying to Eastern Carolina Brody School of Medicine, or you're in Virginia applying to Eastern Virginia, or New Mexico, or all sorts of other schools, then yes, it's going to be probably way easier for you to get into your state public school than an out-of-state school. But then there's variance. California has its very difficult schools, and then University of California at Riverside, which is an easier school to get into, but only if you're from that region. If you're not from the Inland Empire, it's insanely difficult to get into. So
if you're from Massachusetts applying to Riverside, it's going to be a tough admit.
You're basically not gonna. I think in this last cycle, only 4 people interviewed from out of state there, and they were probably applying to a special research program or something like that. So you have to look school by school.
So when you're putting together your list, you've got to be smart about the list you put together to increase your odds and chances. Yeah.
One of the most underrated parts of the process, but one of the most critical.
I'm glad I asked it then.
I'm glad you did too. And obviously, this is where you can come in and help people navigate all of this. And that is your expertise. And you clearly know a lot about it. So also, I just wanted to bring up a statistic that I read on your webpage that 90% of your clients do get into at least one medical school on their first try. So that's a huge percentage, and that's kudos. That's amazing.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, we've been fortunate to help our students achieve awesome success rates. And I tell people all the time, I'm like, do I think we had a hand in it? Absolutely. Do I take most of the credit? No. I'm also very fortunate to work with really exceptional and hardworking students and get to know a bunch of wonderful families. So it's a pleasure.
That's for sure. But knowing the right steps to take and the recipe, that's where you come in. And it's hard to get into medical school without it. So
on that note, can you share with our listeners, if anybody would like to work with you, how they can get in touch? And
yeah, absolutely. And so you could just visit the site, shemmassianconsulting.com, and, reach out anytime at contact@shemmassianconsulting.com. I'm sure we can link to something in the show notes or what have you. Yeah. So we have like a lot of people start out, there's a free 102-page guide on the entire application process. And every week I send, people something really important to read at that time of the year. For their med school admissions process. So in April, I'll send stuff related to applications. In the fall, I'll send something very different. We also help with MCAT tutoring for people who are looking for one-on-one test prep for every aspect of the exam. It's a brutal exam. And so having someone walk you through it is very valuable. So yeah, it'll be pretty easy to find us. When I started this organization, I had no business training or background. I just put my name on it. And I'm like, that's a hard to remember, hard to spell name, but it's memorable. So I'm sure people will come across it.
Oh, for sure. It will stand out. And you work with people everywhere, right? All over the country, all over the world. Yep.
Correct.
Yep. So you don't have to be in San Diego.
No.
Yeah. And if you are driving, we will put that information in the show notes.
Yeah, so, right.
Or cooking or whatever else you're doing. But yeah.
Okay. Well, at the end of the podcast, we'd like to do a quick rapid fire round. It's just a quick 10 questions, not too difficult, and I'm sure you'll nail it. Okay, first car. 2000 Mitsubishi Mirage that was handed down to me from my brother. He got it used, handed it down to me. Are you the second? He's the older brother? Or
He's
no?
the older brder. Yeah.
So you're used to hand me down
start. Yeah, they start with clothing when you're young, and I even
ended up with the car. Yeah. That's how it works. You're lucky to get it, right? Okay, if you could hire a band, any band, to perform for you privately, like a private party, you could hire a band. Who would you bring in?
I'm not a big music guy. The first concert I went to was Maroon 5. Always liked their music. So that was fun.
Awesome. I'd take them. They could.
Yeah, they can come to my private party.
They can come. my friends would enjoy it. Okay. So. All right. If you were invited, would you go on SpaceX?
No.
Neither would I.
Yeah.
I'd like to think I would, but
give me some time. Ask me in a few years.
Yeah. Ask you in a few years for sure. Okay. How do you de-stress?
I eat. And I don't mean like I stress eat, but I really love cooking and eating. And that's like, if I could do anything, I'd love to go out to a restaurant. That's what I enjoy.
Yes. I saw in the research that you don't like to be referred to as a foodie, but you really do like food.
Yes. Right.
I
friends,
do. That's right.
Yeah. I read that too, Meg. That was that. See how stories catch your attention? They hold you in. All right. Assuming you had lunch today, describe your lunch in one word.
Shawarma. I had a chicken shawarma sandwich.
Oh, I love shawarma. I haven't made that in a while because I, on the other hand, went on a cooking strike. So I haven't cooked in a while. But
so COVID does to you after a while. Yeah.
My poor husband has had to step it up. Man. Well, it's from years of cooking for like my kids and like being, and once now they're off in college and stuff, and I can like not have to cook every night. It's just kind of a break. Anyway.
Cooking strikes, I'm all in favor.
I'm on a cooking strike. Not on an eating strike, though.
No, God forbid.
All right. Are you a backseat driver?
Not really.
No, that's good.
Yeah.
I asked that question recently to one of our guests, and she's like, absolutely. I am like on the brakes.
No. Yeah. And it frustrates me when people are when I'm driving.
Yeah, that could be your pet peeve.
Unless you're like right about to hit something, you know,
Right, yeah.
I don't really flip.
Right. Don't be breaking over there in the passenger seat.
That's right.
Okay. All right. Assuming you have a scar, maybe you don't. Best scar story.
Yeah, I mean, I have a little one. It's probably not noticeable to most people. I think when I was really little, I like ran into the corner of a table or something like that.
Yeah. Right. That's pretty
I don't remember
good.
it. Yeah.
You get through these years with only one little scar. That's
right.
That's impressive.
Nothing major.
Good.
And that's a very common one too. The eyebrow there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I actually have one there too. On the side of my nose as well. All right. We're not talking about my scar.
Yeah.
I got it sliding down a banister. But anyway. Okay. All right. Are you a duct tape kind of guy or are you a Mr. Fix-It?
Neither. I'm a hire it kind of guy. I used to think I was like, handy person. I'm like, I can be if I really want, but I don't like it. So I have friends who are more handy than me. I wait till they come over.
Yeah.
And I'm like, hey, dude, by the way, can you do this thing? Can you
help me with this? I have a great bottle of wine and can you?
Yeah. I'm more that guy.
Yeah. All right. Are you a good dancer?
Mm-hmm. I think so.
All right.
That's my wife, but I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's good. You don't do the
no.
live thing.
This is where I live.
That's where I live. That's where I live. Yep. Okay. Last one. Food you cannot live without.
Lebanese food. My favorite
That's probably why you're a good cook because, if you need to get good Lebanese food, you probably have to cook it or not. Maybe not in San Diego, though.
Yeah. I mean, it's not bad down here. I grew up in Los Angeles and it's terrific. Right. I mean, you can get like everything there. It's mind blowing. My mom, was always cooking when we were kids and really loved a lot of the home dishes she would make that you wouldn't necessarily get out. And it's a cuisine that even if it's not someone's favorite cuisine, no one dislikes it. Like everyone, I think, baseline likes it. And it's awesome. I really enjoy it.
Yeah. I'm kind of hungry just thinking about that. Okay, well done. That was 10. Fabulous.
Yeah. All right.
No problem.
Well, thank you so much, Shirag, for coming on and sharing all your amazing knowledge. Just incredibly valuable tips. And I'm sure our listeners will really enjoy hearing them. And thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day, too.
Yeah, likewise. Such a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You've been a great guest, and I'm a little overwhelmed by the amount of work that goes into getting into med school. I'm glad I'm not applying, I'll be honest with you. So, but I would definitely be looking for someone like you to help me through the process. And reach out.
Thanks for saying that.
All right. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye.
Thank you, Shirag, for coming on. This was a really fun conversation. I really enjoyed all of your vast knowledge in this space, and I think this is going to be really helpful to anybody listening that's considering applying to medical school.
Yeah, the whole medical school application process is just such a huge task. It's almost overwhelming and
very daunting.
Daunting, yeah, for sure. And I think getting help in something like this, I mean, if I was going through the process, I'd want help. That's all I can say. So clearly Shirag is an expert in this field and he would be a great person to go to help for. And obviously his links are all in the show notes. So reach out to Shirag, and while you're at it, subscribe to our podcast. We would really appreciate any help you can give us that way. Rate, review, all that stuff. I'm sure you've heard it before. You've heard it from us. You probably hear it on every podcast you listen to, but it really does help us make a difference. So
yeah, definitely take the 3 seconds to do it and greatly helps us out.
Yep.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And thank you, Shirag.
And this has been an Academic and Career Advising Services production.